I used to believe love was proven by how much you endured, how long you stayed quiet, how many doubts you swallowed just to keep the peace. I believed loyalty meant patience, that if someone chose you once, crossed distance for you, built a life beside you, then betrayal simply was not part of the story. I was wrong, not because the signs were loud, but because they were subtle, and because the truth does not always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it comes years later, softly, when your heart is finally strong enough to survive it. I did not fall in love with chaos, I fell in love with certainty. Back then, I believed loyalty showed itself through effort, through consistency, through the kind of devotion that looked organized, intentional, and calm. He was not reckless with words. He was not dramatic with affection. He was structured, disciplined, reassuring. He felt safe, and because he felt safe, I never imagined he could be dangerous to my heart. When people talk about betrayal, they often describe sudden discoveries, messages found, voices overheard, truths exposed in one sharp moment. That was not my story. My story unfolded slowly, so slowly that for years I did not even realize it was happening. At the beginning, there were things I noticed but did not question, because when love feels secure, suspicion has nowhere to sit. He looked at women openly, not briefly, not politely, fully. At the time, I explained it away. I told myself it was cultural. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself that a man who crossed oceans to be with me would not arrive just to betray me. Effort felt like proof, and proof felt like safety. There were trips, work explanations, hours that disappeared politely. Nothing dramatic enough to confront, nothing solid enough to accuse, only moments that asked quiet questions I refused to answer. There was a trip where I stayed behind at a hotel while he said he had work. He mentioned casually that someone would show him around. The tone was light, unimportant, so I treated it that way. When we checked out, that same person embraced him, not briefly, not politely, long enough for time to stretch, long enough for emotion to show itself. I remember standing there smiling politely, confused but calm, because at that time confusion felt safer than clarity. Years later, that memory would return with weight. There were people around us who reacted strangely when things ended. Too much grief, too much shock, too much attachment for something they were not supposed to be part of. At the time, I thought it was kindness, concern. Later, I realized it was guilt. There were children who looked familiar in ways that were impossible to ignore once my eyes were open. Faces that carried certainty, not resemblance. But at the time, love protected the lie. Love made excuses before truth ever got the chance to speak. When everything finally ended, it was not explosive. There was no screaming, no confrontation worthy of a movie scene, just silence, distance, and a flight that felt longer than it should have. On that flight, something shifted, not heartbreak, awareness. It was as if my heart left my body briefly, wandered through old memories, and returned holding evidence. Moments I had ignored lined up quietly, not to hurt me, but to explain everything. Suddenly, nothing felt confusing anymore. Years later, confirmation arrived, not as a shock, but as a quiet nod from the universe. Yes, you were right to feel uneasy. Yes, your instincts were not broken. Yes, what you survived had a shape and a name. By then, I was no longer angry. I was no longer shocked. I was simply aware. He had been generous, with money, with solutions, with provision. But generosity is not loyalty, and provision is not faithfulness. When my child prepared to leave home years later, I prayed differently than I ever had before. Not loudly, not desperately, intentionally. I did not pray for revenge. I did not pray for justice. I prayed that cycles would end, that silence would stop traveling through generations disguised as strength, that love would no longer require blindness to survive. That prayer carried everything I never said out loud, everything I endured quietly, everything I misunderstood for too long. Time did not make the betrayal smaller, it made me stronger. And strength did not come from confrontation, it came from clarity. I learned that loyalty is not proven by how much you tolerate, it is revealed by how much truth someone can hold without hiding. I learned that love does not ask you to shrink your awareness, it asks you to trust it. And most of all, I learned this. The most dangerous lies are not the ones told loudly, they are the ones you participate in because they feel safer than the truth. I thought love meant loyalty because I believed the years I gave, the silence I kept, and the trust I placed would protect my heart. Time taught me otherwise, not to punish me, but to free me, and that lesson stayed with me far longer than the heartbreak ever did. I did not leave that relationship with bitterness. I left it with a strange calm that confused people around me. They expected anger, they expected grief, they expected a woman undone. But what I felt was something else entirely. It was the quiet exhaustion that comes after carrying a truth you were never allowed to name. It was the stillness that followed years of emotional noise you trained yourself not to hear. For a long time, I replayed moments not to punish myself, but to understand myself. Why I stayed silent, why I accepted explanations that never quite fit, why I believed endurance was the same thing as devotion. I had mistaken tolerance for strength, and strength, I would later learn, is not about how much you can endure quietly. It's about how much truth you are willing to face without running. There were nights after everything ended when I lay awake, not crying, not praying, just thinking about how often women are taught to doubt their instincts, how easily we are praised for sacrifice but rarely protected from it, how silence is rewarded as maturity even when it's slowly erasing us. I thought about how many times I had chosen peace over clarity, how many times I had told myself it was better not to know. And I wondered who I might have been if I had trusted myself sooner. Time passed. Life moved forward in ways that felt unfamiliar at first. I learned how to exist without explaining myself, without filling gaps, without softening truths to make others comfortable. I became quieter, but not smaller. People sometimes mistook that quiet for sadness. It was not sadness, it was discernment. I stopped offering access to people who could not hold honesty. I stopped mistaking charm for character. I stopped believing that effort automatically meant integrity. I learned to watch actions without narrating excuses over them. Years later, when I heard the full truth, it did not reopen wounds. It simply confirmed what my body had known long before my mind was ready to admit it. There were other women, other lives, other stories that had intersected with mine without my knowledge, children whose existence rewrote memories I once defended, moments that finally made sense without resistance. It was strange how relief arrived before pain, relief that I had not imagined it, relief that my instincts had not failed me, relief that what I survived had meaning. I grieved then, but not for the relationship. I grieved for the woman I had been when I thought love required self-abandonment. I grieved for the patience I had wasted on confusion. I grieved for the years I spent proving loyalty to someone who never learned how to return it. But grief did not stay long, because something else grew in its place: respect for myself. A steady, unshakable understanding that love does not demand blindness, that loyalty does not require silence, that trust is not built by ignoring discomfort, but by honoring it. I began to see my past not as a failure, but as an education, one that taught me how easily devotion can be manipulated, how generosity can be mistaken for goodness, how calm can hide chaos when you are trained not to ask questions. I no longer wondered how I missed the signs. I understood why I survived them, and that understanding changed the way I moved through the world. I listened more carefully. I spoke more slowly. I trusted patterns over promises. And for the first time, love stopped feeling like something I had to earn. It felt like something that would recognize me without explanation. Years later, when I look back, I do not feel anger toward the man I loved. I feel clarity, because what he gave me was not loyalty, but what I gained from the truth was freedom. And freedom, I learned, is the most honest form of love there is. There was a season after that when people assumed I was closed off. They said I had built walls. They said I had become distant. What they did not understand was that I had finally learned the difference between privacy and fear. I was not hiding anymore. I was protecting what I had rebuilt. I had spent years explaining myself inside a relationship that never fully listened. Now I no longer felt the need to narrate my pain in advance or soften my boundaries to make them acceptable. Silence had changed meaning for me. Before, silence had been obedience. Now, it was choice. I noticed how differently the world responded when I stopped overgiving, when I stopped anticipating needs that were never spoken, when I stopped filling emotional gaps that were not mine to fill. Some people drifted away, others became uncomfortable, and a few revealed themselves very quickly. That clarity was not lonely, it was clean. I began to understand how often women are taught to confuse emotional labor with love, how we are praised for staying, even when staying costs us ourselves, how we are told that loyalty means holding things together, even when we are the only ones holding anything at all. No one ever taught us that loyalty without truth is just endurance. I thought back to the early days when I had believed that effort was evidence, that distance crossed was devotion, that structure meant safety. Now I knew better. Effort can be strategic, structure can hide absence, calm can be rehearsed. Loyalty does not feel like doubt you constantly have to quiet. It does not require you to become smaller to maintain peace. It does not ask you to trade intuition for reassurance. True loyalty leaves room for questions. As the years passed, I watched relationships around me with new eyes. I noticed how often people stayed not because they were loved, but because they were afraid of starting over. How often silence was mistaken for harmony. I stopped romanticizing endurance. I stopped celebrating how much someone could tolerate. Instead, I paid attention to ease, to openness, to how safe it felt to be honest without rehearsing. There were moments when old memories still surfaced, not to hurt me, but to remind me. I would see a familiar expression on a stranger's face. hear a certain tone in someone's voice, and I would feel that quiet internal pause, not fear, recognition, and I would choose differently. That's how healing actually shows itself, not in dramatic declarations, but in small, steady decisions that honor what you once ignored. I did not become bitter. I became discerning. I did not stop believing in love. I stopped believing in illusions, and that difference changed everything. There came a day when someone asked me if I would ever love like that again, with that level of devotion, that depth of patience. I thought about it carefully before answering. I said yes, but never at the cost of myself, because love that asks you to disappear is not love. It is control disguised as connection. I learned that loyalty is not proven by how long you stay when something feels wrong. It's proven by how honestly someone shows up when things are clear. I learned that trust is not about believing harder. It's about noticing sooner. And most of all, I learned this. Sometimes the truth waits until you are strong enough to survive it, not because it is cruel, but because it is kind. And when it finally arrives, it hands you back to yourself. That's what happened to me. Not all at once, not loudly, but completely. After that, life did not suddenly become perfect. Healing never works that way. There were ordinary days, quiet days, days where nothing dramatic happened at all. And yet, those were the days where I noticed the change the most. I would wake up and realize my chest felt lighter, not happy exactly, just unburdened. I was no longer carrying explanations that no one had asked for. I was no longer bracing myself for disappointment before it arrived. For a long time, I confused vigilance with love. I thought staying alert meant staying committed. I thought watching closely meant caring deeply. But vigilance is exhausting. Love is not meant to keep you on edge. I began to trust my body again, the way it tightened when something was off, the way it relaxed when something was true. For years, I had overridden those signals. I had told myself I was overthinking. I had told myself not to be difficult. I had told myself that loyalty meant patience. Now I knew patience without reciprocity is self-abandonment. There were conversations I replayed in my mind, not with anger, but with clarity. Moments where I had laughed something off. Moments where I had accepted an answer that never quite answered the question. I saw how often I had chosen peace over honesty, and how much that peace had cost me. What surprised me most was not the betrayal itself. It was how long I had protected someone else's image at the expense of my own reality. I had edited my story while I was still living it, softened it, shortened it, made it easier to digest. When the truth finally settled, it did not arrive with chaos. It arrived with order. Things lined up. Memories made sense. Silences found their meaning. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. I stopped asking why things happened. I started asking what they taught me. They taught me that love does not require performance, that loyalty does not demand blindness, that commitment without honesty is not commitment at all. There was a moment, much later, when I stood alone in a familiar place and realized something quietly powerful. I was no longer waiting for closure. Closure had arrived the day I stopped needing permission to trust myself. That is when I knew I was no longer living in reaction. I was living in alignment. And from that place, everything feels different. From that point on, I began to notice how silence changes when it is no longer fearful. Before, silence had felt like something I needed to fill, with explanations, with patience, with benefit of the doubt. Now, silence felt honest. I did not rush to explain myself anymore. I did not rush to smooth over discomfort. I let pauses exist. I let unanswered questions stay unanswered. And in those spaces, I learned something important about myself. I had been taught that love required endurance, that staying meant strength, that leaving meant failure. But endurance without dignity is not strength, it is erosion. I remembered how often I had measured love by sacrifice, how much of myself I was willing to give up, how quiet I could become, how flexible I could bend. I thought that was maturity. Now I understood it was fear dressed up as loyalty. There were nights when memories returned uninvited, not the dramatic ones, the small ones, the way my voice softened when I asked certain questions, the way I already knew the answer but asked anyway, the way I smiled to make things easier. Those moments did not hurt anymore. They instructed. They showed me how deeply I had wanted to believe and how gently I had betrayed myself to do so. I stopped blaming the past version of me. She was not foolish. She was hopeful. Hope can make you generous with trust, too generous. I began rebuilding slowly, not my life, my boundaries. I practiced saying no without explaining. I practiced listening to discomfort without apologizing for it. I practiced trusting the first feeling instead of waiting for proof. And something unexpected happened. Peace stopped feeling fragile. It became steady, unimpressive, reliable. I realized that real peace does not announce itself. It does not rush in. It settles. People sometimes ask when I knew for sure, when the truth finally landed. It was not during a confrontation, not during a confession, not during an apology. It was on an ordinary afternoon. I was alone, doing nothing important, and I realized I no longer felt the urge to explain my story to anyone who hadn't lived it. That was the moment. The truth had taken root. I no longer needed validation. I no longer needed understanding from the people who had misunderstood me. I understood myself, and that understanding changed the way I loved afterward. I became slower, more selective, more grounded. I stopped mistaking intensity for intimacy. I stopped equating effort with sincerity. I learned that love should feel safe in the body, not anxious, not performative, not conditional. Loyalty, I discovered, is not proven through endurance. It is proven through consistency. And once you learn that, you cannot unknow it. You start choosing differently, not louder, just clearer. And the truth is, the person who changed the most was not the one who left. It was me. Because once you stop mistaking survival for love, everything you accept changes. After that realization, my world grew quieter, but not empty. Quiet in a way that lets you hear yourself think. Quiet in a way that exposes what you've been avoiding. I started noticing how my body reacted to people before my mind made excuses. Tight shoulders, a shallow breath, the need to rehearse sentences in advance. Those were never nerves, they were warnings. I used to ignore them because I thought love required trust without conditions. I thought suspicion meant damage. I thought asking questions meant insecurity. Now I know that clarity is not suspicion, it is self-respect. There were friendships that slowly dissolved, not because of conflict, but because I no longer performed the version of myself that made them comfortable. Some people only know how to love you when you're quiet, when you're flexible, when you're grateful for less. When you change, they call it distance, but it's actually alignment. I spent time alone learning what felt like mine again, my routines, my preferences, my pace. I ate when I was hungry, I rested when I was tired, I spoke when something felt wrong. No one argued with me, no one corrected my instincts. That absence taught me more than any conversation ever did. I reflected often on the early days, not with bitterness, but with curiosity. Why had loyalty felt like self-abandonment back then, and why did it feel like self-protection now? The answer was simple and difficult at the same time. I had confused attachment with devotion, fear with commitment, endurance with love. Real loyalty does not ask you to disappear. It does not require silence to survive. It does not punish you for noticing patterns. Real loyalty stays consistent when you speak up. I learned that some people are only loyal to the version of you that does not challenge them. And when you evolve, they call it betrayal. But growth is not betrayal. It is honesty catching up. There were moments I felt grief, not for the relationship itself, but for the time I spent doubting my own knowledge. Grief for the questions I swallowed. Grief for the truth I postponed. Grief for how long I stayed loyal to a story that no longer protected me. I let myself feel that grief fully, without rushing to forgive, without rushing to reframe it as a lesson. Some things need to be mourned before they can be understood. And slowly, the weight lifted. I no longer replayed conversations. I no longer imagined alternative endings. I no longer waited for clarity from someone else. Clarity had already arrived. It had arrived quietly, years later, exactly when I was ready to listen. And from that place, I began to live differently. Not defensively, not hardened, but I'm awake. I chose honesty over harmony, consistency over chemistry, peace over potential. And the most surprising part was this: love did not disappear. It changed shape. It became slower, softer, more mutual. It no longer asked me to prove my worth through patience. It did not require me to shrink to be chosen. It met me where I stood. And once you experience that kind of love, even briefly, you understand something that cannot be explained. You understand that loyalty without truth is just a habit, and love without truth is only attachment wearing a familiar face. That understanding stays with you in every conversation, every pause, every decision. It becomes the quiet standard you no longer negotiate. And that is how the truth changes you. From that point on, my memories stopped hurting and started teaching. I remembered how often I had explained away discomfort, how quickly I translated confusion into patience, how easily I believed that love was supposed to feel uncertain if it was real. No one had told me that stability can feel unfamiliar when chaos has been normalized. No one had warned me that calm can feel boring if you are used to proving yourself. I was not weak back then. I was hopeful. And hope, when misplaced, can quietly exhaust a person. I began to see how loyalty had shaped my decisions. The jobs I stayed in too long, the conversations I softened, the boundaries I delayed. I had been loyal to outcomes instead of my inner voice, loyal to promises instead of patterns, loyal to the idea of who someone could be, not who they consistently were. That realization did not arrive with anger. It arrived with relief, because it meant nothing was wrong with me. I had simply been trained to tolerate uncertainty and call it devotion. As time passed, people noticed the change. They said I seemed distant, more reserved, harder to read. What they did not see was how grounded I felt. I was no longer reacting, I was choosing. I learned to sit with silence without filling it, to let pauses exist without rescuing them, to allow people to reveal themselves without interruption. And they always did. Some grew closer, some faded away. Both outcomes felt right. I stopped explaining my boundaries. I stopped negotiating my needs. I stopped chasing reassurance. When something felt off, I trusted that feeling. Not immediately, not dramatically, but attentively. There is a quiet power in no longer needing to be convinced. I also learned how deeply loyalty can be weaponized, how it can be praised when it benefits others and criticized the moment it benefits you. People admire your endurance until you stop enduring. That was a hard truth to accept, but it was also freeing. I realized that the version of me who stayed quiet was easy to love. She asked for little, she accepted uncertainty, she waited. But the version of me who asked questions, who paused before agreeing, who chose herself, was unfamiliar. And unfamiliarity often feels threatening to those who benefited from your silence. I stopped trying to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding me. Instead, I focused on understanding myself. I asked difficult questions in private. What do I actually want? What do I feel when no one is watching? What would my life look like if I trusted myself fully? The answers were not dramatic. They were practical. They were calm. I wanted honesty without interrogation, affection without anxiety, consistency without explanation. And slowly, my life aligned with those answers. Not perfectly, not quickly, but steadily. I learned that loyalty should feel like safety, not sacrifice, like partnership, not endurance, like choice, not obligation. And once you know that, you cannot unknow it. You begin to notice when words and actions drift apart, when effort becomes performative, when affection arrives only after pressure. You stop arguing with reality. You stop waiting for closure that has already been delivered through behavior. That is when peace enters. Not loudly, not all at once, but gently. It settles into your routines, your tone, your expectations. You stop asking for more from people who have already shown you their limit. And instead, you build a life that no longer requires you to abandon yourself to feel loved. That is what the truth did to me. It did not make me colder. It made me clearer. And clarity changes everything. With clarity came a different kind of courage. Not the loud kind, not the kind that announces itself, but the quiet courage of no longer bending just to be chosen. I began to notice how often love is confused with endurance, How many people are praised for staying instead of being respected for leaving? How often loyalty is rewarded with neglect? No one teaches you that walking away can be an act of self-respect, that choosing yourself does not make you disloyal, it makes you honest. I stopped rewriting memories to make them hurt less. I let them be what they were: incomplete, uneven, true. And in doing so, I forgave myself, not for loving, but for staying too long after love stopped being mutual. There is a moment in every life when you realize you are no longer waiting, not for answers, not for change, not for effort. That moment is quiet, almost ordinary, but it changes the direction of everything. You stop explaining why something hurt. You stop justifying why something mattered. You stop hoping that someone will finally see what you have been giving all along. You understand that the right people never require you to disappear to stay. And once you understand that, you cannot go back. The truth does not always come to expose someone else. Sometimes it comes to rescue you. It does not shout. It does not accuse. It simply stands still and waits for you to be brave enough to see it. I thought love meant loyalty. Years later, I learned that love also means discernment. It means knowing when devotion turns into self-abandonment. It means knowing when to stay and when to let go. And if this story feels familiar, if it stirred something quiet inside you, then I want you to pause here with me. Ask yourself where you have been loyal at the cost of your peace, where you have stayed silent to keep something together, where you have mistaken endurance for love. Your truth is already speaking. You do not need permission to listen anymore. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment and tell me which part stayed with you the longest. And if you want more stories like this, stories about truth, self-respect, and the quiet strength it takes to choose yourself, subscribe and stay here with me. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is finally tell yourself the truth.